I'm pleased today to introduce Professor John Agnew from UCLA. Professor Agnew comes to us by way of the Geography Department, who has honored him with the Chauncey Harris Lectureship, which took place yesterday in the Kimball Tower before a vast audience, at which Professor Agnew spoke on the difficulties of establishing a national capital in Rome, a city that had always understood itself to be an intranational urban space. And today we've asked Professor Agnew to talk on a different topic, Europe, in quotation marks, NATO, and the United States, the new geopolitics of European security. Professor Agnew, as I said, is a professor of geography at UCLA. He did his undergraduate work in the UK at Exeter, and then his graduate work at Ohio State. He's the author of a number of books, including Hegemony, The New Shape of Global Power, which came out last year, Geopolitics, Revisioning World Politics, and Place in Politics in Modern Italy, which came out a few years before that. Again, his topic today will be European security and the interaction between Europe, NATO, and the United States. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor John Agnew.
Okay, thanks, Wade, for that introduction. What I want to do today is present something about what I call the new geopolitics of European security, in which what I try to do is link together a number of dimensions of European security that are not typically connected together. I'm going to begin with a discussion of how a unified European political space has been envisaged and recently put into effect. And my discussion, perhaps because I'm a geographer, includes particular attention to the geographical limits of Europe and the question of common norms among member states. I then want to turn to the Cold War inheritance, particularly that of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the possibility of a purely European security compact replacing NATO. So the main focus here is on how the Yalta Agreement in 1945, the Marshall Plan of 1947, and then NATO, founded initially in 1949, split Europe into competing parts, and how the lingering impact of these still divides Europe to this day. At the same time, NATO recently has become a strange sort of halfway house between estrangement and full membership in the EU in parts of East Central Europe. And the main mechanism more generally today for European military interventionism beyond European shores. For example, NATO now is actively involved in Afghanistan, the first time that NATO has actually been involved in any military activity beyond Europe. I then turn to the critical issue, as I see it, of U.S.-European relations and whether or not there can ever be a return to business as usual after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which divided European countries one from another. The U.S.-Europe security relationship has entered into crisis for a complex set of reasons, although these are often reduced to sound bites. You're probably familiar with the most famous of these. The U.S. is from Mars and Europe from Venus, which I think was originally applied to how men and women have trouble speaking to one another. That in this case also failed to do justice to a messier world. And then finally, I raised the specter of the increased tension between the security agendas of the member states of the European Union on the one hand and the security goals of European unification on the other. So the primary point is that the European Union is still an organization of states, even though much of the dominant discourse of European unity envisages some new institutional entity that certainly does not yet exist and shows as yet only a few weak signs of existing, at least in relation to security and military affairs. In the conclusion, then, I suggest that controversy over the idea of a separate political Europe, U.S.-European tensions, and the difficulty of establishing new superpowers set real limits to the goal of a single European enterprise. First of all, then, something on Europe as a political space. Europe is a concept that floats between geographical, cultural, and political definitional poles. First of all, it's a geographical term. Unfortunately, its location is very difficult to fix. Its heartland is as hard to demarcate as are its notoriously shifting borders. Pocock claims that the ancient Greeks located Europa in the lands west of the Bosphorus, in what today we would call the Balkans. It is an area that has had much difficulty being accepted recently as European by many people to its north and west. But there has never been a definitive geographical measure of how to divide Europe from Asia. Definitions such as from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains may sound definitive, but they're just mere conventions. The eastern border has been variously defined, with Russia and Turkey, for example, neither fully inside nor outside the continent. Even so, the geographic category of the continent has acquired an elemental status in organizing and understanding how the world works. However vague, it provides a template onto which other criteria are projected. By extension, then, the indeterminacy of Europe is not only geographic. The European idea is cultural more than anything else. Most typically in this usage, Europe is merely the modern designation for Christendom, as defined by the medieval popes. In fact, as Anthony Pagden reminds us, Christianity's roots are entirely Asian. The religion spread to Europe from somewhere else. Admittedly, the Latin Roman Church did originally constitute the nexus for a supra-European organization after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Again, however, this raises doubts about the European bona fides of much of Eastern Europe. If Turkey is easily excluded on this criterion, as many opponents of Turkey's entry into the EU see as foundational, and Albania and Bosnia because of their Muslim majorities, what to make of Orthodox Christian Russia, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, or the Ukraine? Politically, the supremacy of Western Europe and Christianity in this understanding suggests something about who has been doing the defining. Partly to justify their national projects, but also in some cases to give a civilizational veneer to their imperial designs beyond European shores, it has been Western European elites who have been most exercised about and most capable of establishing the meaning of Europe. This has been the case since the medieval knights, clerics, and peasants of Latin Europe expanded into the edges of Europe, thus laying the groundwork for a more homogeneous cultural sphere well beyond their initial territory of occupation. But it has been especially so since Western Europeans, such as the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French, began creating their extra-European empires in the 16th century. They looked in teleological self-justification to where they came from, a Europe that was special, creative, innovative, free, and more adventurous than other places, to explain their success in doing so. European intellectuals have continued these efforts by invoking special environmental and cultural conditions that set Europe apart. In tying together colonization within Europe with that outside, Bartlett, for example, makes the vital point, and I quote, "Europe, the initiator of one of the world's major processes of conquest, colonization, and cultural transformation, was also the product of one." Unavoidable as it is, defining the meaning of Europe is invariably problematic. As a result, some commentators have urged to focus solely on how Europe is used as a discursive category and how it crops up in debate over Europeanness, the cultural and political form institutionalized by states and supranational organizations such as the EU. From this viewpoint, images of an emerging European order must be related to the longer history of nation statehood and how state elites in Europe have long traded in using ideas about Europe, particularly links back to the classical Greeks and Romans, special environmental conditions, and so on, to legitimize their European and global roles. After World War II and the Holocaust, however, any European claim to be an uncontaminated seat of high culture or civilization, the land of Goethe and Beethoven, had to come to terms with the reality of an industrialized mass extermination based on religious affiliation. After that time, barbarism now obviously existed at home and not just beyond Europe's borders. Beginning in the 1970s, though obviously having older roots, Europe began to compete with the states. Europe, and I put it in scare quotes, began to compete with the states in an explicit and officially endorsed discourse about European identity. This was one of the main purposes of the Copenhagen Summit of the European Community, as the future EU was then called in 1973, which laid down a set of norms promoting, at that time, a Western European identity. First of all, the unity of the then 9 members, responsibility to the rest of the world, moving outwards from those European states not yet members, through the countries of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Africa, to the United States, based, it said, on equality and the spirit of friendship, then to Japan and Canada, détente with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and finally to China and Latin America. Thirdly, the dynamic nature of the construction of a political Europe. While emphasizing as a central theme the struggle against underdevelopment in general, what is most interesting about the list of regions under the second criterion is that the Middle East ranked higher than the United States. This was, after all, the year following the collapse of the dollar and the year of the OPEC oil price shock associated in the popular mind with the major Middle Eastern oil producers. Often taken as the founding moment of the era of globalization, the massively important if unintended outcome of these events, the early 1970s was also a time of economic crisis in the European community as the growth momentum of the member states faltered and the accession of Britain promised increasing dissent over supranational policies. So, and to quote from Malmberg and Strath, the utopian dream of a common identity was mobilized precisely at this moment when the cohesion of the European community was conspicuous by its absence. Integration was the concept of the 1950s and 1960s, which was used in the Cold War to conjure up images of European unity and for translating Europe into a political project. When integration failed as an instrument of mobilization, identity was promoted in its place. So this is how Europe has become completely intertwined in official discourse and much academic writing with the political project now associated with the European Union, Europe and the European Union. Though it's easy to show that with Eurobarometer surveys and other data that a European identity, at least in the Copenhagen sense, is still relatively weak compared to national ones across Europe, not least because it privileged the old standard Western Europe, there is a sense in which the EU and other institutions with European member states, such as the Council of Europe, NATO, and so on, have developed common norms that imply, in an institutional context at least, that there may be an emerging European political space. Turning now to the Cold War inheritance. The downing of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 has become something of a clean break in the conventional history of contemporary Europe. Rather like the claim that everything changed after September the 11th, 2001, the end of the Cold War, which had dominated European geopolitics for the previous 40 years, has proved, in fact, to be something less than cataclysmic. In fact, a number of its most important features have not only lived on, so to speak, but have even undergone revival. One is a continuing East-West divide in Europe, not just in terms of standards of living and economic development, but also in terms of worldviews and cultural expectations. Eased somewhat with the invocation in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union by local people, of the designation of much of communist Eastern Europe as Central Europe, and thus less distant from the Western heartland, and by the EU strategy of admitting some states preferentially because of their greater conformity to Western political and economic norms, there is nevertheless a continuing sense of difference on both sides, going back many years, but reinforced by the drawing of US and Soviet spheres of influence at the Yalta Conference in 1945, and through the subsequent administration of the Marshall Plan solely in Western Europe, and with the creation of the Pan-Atlantic NATO in 1949, and the arrival of the Soviet-sponsored Warsaw Pact in 1955. Catherine Verdery, for example, argues that the division of Europe in the 1940s shaped what she calls the subsequent cognitive organization of the world. Even today, therefore, and on both sides of the divide, assumptions about attitudes to work, conceptions of the state, understandings of history, valuation of U.S. foreign policy, and opinions about other ethnic groups and nationalities are held to differ profoundly. At first sight, the most surprising inheritance from the Cold War is that of NATO. Plausibly regarded as an organization without a role at the end of the Cold War, After the disappearance of its primary foe, the Soviet Union, it has undergone something of a revival. This suggests not only that international institutions have staying power even when reason of state might suggest otherwise, but they can invent new stories for themselves in order to stay in business. The revival of NATO seems to have happened for several reasons. One is that it has been an instrument for bringing East Central Europe into the European fold in anticipation of later accession to the European Union. Eastward enlargement of NATO has thus anticipated the enlargement of the EU. Much of this has depended on picturing Russia in particular as either a lingering or a possible future threat to European security. The Clinton administration, for example, was particularly anxious to paint this sort of picture when Boris Yeltsin was still Russia's president. There was much anxiety at that time about a Russian collapse. Local pressure was added to this. Given the recent history of Russian military and political dominance in Eastern Europe, East European skepticism about Russian motivations is not very surprising. This has undoubtedly been enhanced by Russian intransigence in conflicts in the Caucasus, above all in Chechnya, explicit Russian involvement in challenging unwanted political change in such places as Georgia and the Ukraine, and the more recent reassertion of central government control over the Russian economy by President Vladimir Putin, and latterly by the explicit use of Russian gas and oil supplies to Europe as a geopolitical weapon. Putin, however, is hard to characterize in simple anti-Western terms, and he's undoubtedly tried to respond reasonably to the approach of NATO to Russia's immediate borders. So when West European governments insist that Russia should behave as if it were an applicant to the EU, even though neither entry into it nor into NATO is on offer, they cannot expect anything but a chilly reception. Another reason for NATO's revival is that since the 1990s, the organization has become committed to so-called humanitarian interventions, initially in the Balkans, but now more widely, but has been further stimulated by the US government and its declared worldwide war on terror. The stimulus here lies partly in US military overstretch, particularly in Iraq, but also in the US attempt to have Europe share more of the burden of nation building and peacekeeping around the world. So far, the major intervention has been in Afghanistan, fighting against the Taliban that was ousted from Kabul in 2001, but which is now back as a significant insurgent force in the southern and eastern parts of the country. Although the European Union as such has become involved in peacekeeping missions abroad, for example in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and under UN auspices in Lebanon from the summer of 2006, there has been a limited development of a European security apparatus outside of the confines of NATO. Partly this is the result of US and British opposition, but it is also because of the inherent difficulties of coordinating the foreign policies of member states, as illustrated most dramatically in the disarray in 2003 at the time the US announced its invasion of Iraq, with France and Germany adamantly opposed, and Britain, Spain, and Italy giving various levels of open support. A number of EU members do not belong to NATO, for example, Ireland, Sweden, Finland, and Austria. And of course, the US, Canada, Iceland, Norway, and Turkey are non-EU members, and some countries are still en route to EU membership, for example, who are members of NATO, like Bulgaria and Romania. This lack of overlap makes for serious complication in seeing NATO as the security arm of Europe. Much skepticism has been expressed about NATO's capacity to deliver on military commitments so far from home. The lack of collective agreement about foreign policy goals across the Atlantic Alliance makes it unlikely that further missions beyond that in Afghanistan will ever take place. If the intervention in Afghanistan goes badly, then NATO may well have finally reached the end of its road. Then there may well be no other choice than to establish some sort of purely European security apparatus, but for use in the immediate neighborhood rather than on the other side of the world. The US versus Europe. Beyond these specific legacies, perhaps the major inheritance of the Cold War is the continuing political and security relationship across the Atlantic with the United States. Through NATO, the US obviously has a continuing alliance with many European states, but this relationship has come under enormous strain over the past 3 years, in large part because of the post-September the 11th obsession of the US administration with Iraq and the questioning by some European leaders, particularly President Chirac in France and the former Chancellor Schröder in Germany, of the purported intelligence about weapons of mass destruction and an Iraq terrorism connection that the US government used to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. Of course, some European leaders, such as Tony Blair in Britain, following the fabled special relationship with the United States, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, José Manuel Barroso in Portugal, now the president of the European Commission, and José María Aznar, the former Prime Minister of Spain, opted to support the US policy, illustrating how difficult constructing an EU foreign policy will be. Subsequent revelations about the fabrication of much of the intelligence and the disastrous course of the occupation, not to mention the repeated use of inaccurate analogies to World War II and the dangers of appeasement, have made many European governments increasingly wary of following the lead of the United States. In the face of widespread public opposition across Europe to recent US foreign policies. At the same time, however, the US administration view of NATO shows signs of becoming shoehorned into a particular view of the world it adopted after September the 11th, 2001. This involves moving away from an Atlantic partnership towards a global alliance in which other member countries, no longer limited to North America and Europe, will take a subsidiary role to the United States in a worldwide war on terror. Europe in this construction has lost its centrality to US foreign policy as the Middle East, because of oil and terrorism, and East Asia, because of trade and credit, have risen in importance. US military unilateralism, particularly in relation to what Sol Cohen calls the Eurasian Convergence Zone, from the Baltic to the Black Sea through Central Asia to Korea, has introduced a new disequilibrium into world politics that threatens the geopolitical status quo. This explicit US devaluation of Europe's role in NATO, however, is just the tip of a veritable iceberg of differences between, for example, the approval of most European states for both directly and through the EU on the one hand, and the opposition of the United States on the other to the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, the ban on anti-personnel landmines, the Biodiversity Treaty, and the verification procedures for the Biological Weapons Control Treaty. During the Cold War, Western European governments often deferred to US governments, even as they were, in fact, seriously consulted by them. In one perspective, with the Cold War's end and the increased political economic strength of the EU relative to the US, plus the everyday familiarity with negotiation and compromise that the EU requires, Europeans have continued to engage in multilateral approaches to global problems such as terrorism, environmental risk, and drug trafficking, just as the US, in a fit of imperial hubris, has become increasingly unilateral. Returning to the status quo ante, a phrase made popular this last summer by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, in European-US relations seems unlikely after these recent bones of contention. The parting of ways does not appear to be simply contingent on a series of policy disagreements, but based on a much more profound geopolitical alienation between the United States and Europe. This has roots in the now competing cultures of diplomacy and statecraft, as well as in very different adaptations to the post-Cold War world. Opinion surveys report increased differences in popular attitudes between the two sides of the Atlantic about, for example, general cultural values relating to personal freedom and government control over behavior and the provision of goods and services, the desirability of the spread of American customs relating to food and consumption, and the U.S. government is in fact seen in some quarters, in fact, as a threat to world peace. If in the United States the predominant sense of victory in the Cold War has encouraged a triumphal attitude towards hitherto valued allies, in Europe the Cold War is seen as having ended because of the exhaustion of the Soviet model and its failure to enchant those it conquered, and leads to a skeptical view of all imperialisms, whether in rhetorically democratic or in other guise. Okay, finally, in terms of the states versus the EU. This doesn't mean that the sense of purpose of the EU or Europe in the world has become any clearer, even in the face of this disaffection between the United States and the countries of Europe. The failure to move forward in reorganizing the EU after the victory of the no vote in the French and Dutch referenda of 2005, no on a new constitution for Europe, suggests a serious crisis in the European political project. This is certainly not the first such predicament, but because it involves how the EU works and relates to member states, now totaling 25, it may be the most serious. Democratic responsibility is now at center stage. This may in fact make further enlargement that includes many Balkan states and Turkey increasingly difficult. Yet in so doing it will also reduce the leverage that the EU has come to exercise over states waiting to join. This has been one of the most important collective powers exercised by the EU beyond its borders. At the same time, insecurity over opening markets has driven voters in many member states into renewed enthusiasm for their national governments, as the EU is now condemned both as an agent of globalization and as a barrier to its effectiveness in answering economic woes. Just follow the French presidential election campaign over the next few months. But optimists can point to the fact that the EU does at least now have an official common foreign policy position, and the desire, if not much by way of the ability to carry it out, remains in place. As Alan Millward rightly says, and I quote, "Even when these policies amount only to declarations, they remind us that it would be very difficult to find anything comparable in Europe's long history." Unfortunately, there is as yet an absence of effective leadership and institutional reorganization to push this forward. As a result, tensions and conflicts between particular states have come to dominate debate over Europe's political future shape. The reassertion of states thus pushes Europe, if you like, into the background. With respect to the common foreign policy, for example, though there is a Commissioner for Foreign Affairs and a common foreign and security policy, the office is beholden to the decisions of member states without much reference to its operation. National governments still jealously guard their foreign policy imperatives. These will not be surrendered until the EU itself is reformed to make it both more democratic and more decisive, if they are not mutually contradictory. John Gillingham's conclusion that common defense and security policy will go nowhere until European taxpayers are willing to foot the bill for it lies in the distant future, seems largely correct. Although de-Europeanization of foreign and security policy can be seen as operating in numerous countries, not least in Germany, Franco-British differences have in fact become central to this impasse. What is most striking is how differences over their foreign policies reflect long-standing conventional wisdom in the two countries. As Philip Stevens cogently argues, following their common debacle in the Suez Crisis of 1956, political elites in the two countries drew different conclusions about where to go next. If the French decided to use Europe as a counterweight to the US, the British opted for the American connection. Neither has worked out as planned, but they will both have to bury the hatchet if Europe is to effectively develop its own foreign policy. This is not on the horizon. I quote Stevens, "It's not only the French with their efforts to build the Maginot Line against globalization." Remember, they built a Maginot Line against the Germans in the 1930s, and the Germans just went around it, who refused to reclaim the future from the past. Driving in London the other day, I saw a large official hoarding, a big billboard, that's right. Thanks for the translation. That heralded a weekend of celebrations to mark Wellington's victory against Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. "Celebrate one European win they can never take away," the hoarding proudly declared. The Battle of Waterloo, the last time these British thought they won anything in Europe. France and Britain are also Europe's two nuclear powers and the two countries with the continent's largest military-industrial complexes, if we exclude Russia. These factors have undoubtedly worked against a meeting of minds on foreign policy. In France, the first, the idea of being a nuclear power, has remained closely associated with the office of the president, and thus with the prestige of the country. At key moments, French presidents invoke the force de frappe to emphasize France's great power status, even as the defense of Europe is also symbolically evoked. For example, President Chirac on the 19th of January this year made a speech about using nuclear weapons against states sheltering terrorists. I don't know whether anyone recalls this. And the idea was that this wasn't just for France, but this was for Europe. Chirac neglected to say how Europe might go about launching a nuclear weapon. In Britain, its independent nuclear force is dependent entirely on U.S. designs. Quite what either force adds to European security remains far from clear. Defense industries, however, suggest a more intricate impact. There is now considerable collaboration between European defense firms, including French and British ones, to the extent that some write about the growth of a European security industrial complex. But this view is more a reflection of the existence of an official EU security research program and growing collaborative ventures between firms in different countries, rather than an accomplished fact with a common industrial base that has a multinational character. Indeed, there is much evidence that not only are some major actors, such as BAE Systems, which is the main British defense contractor, being more interested in breaking into the US market than expanding in Europe, but consolidation across national borders has been restricted, with cross-border links mainly limited to joint ventures. So if the English Channel may still be particularly wide when it comes to defense industry consolidation, other European borders also continue to interfere with the creation of anything equivalent to the US military-industrial complex. Countervailing pressures against the tendency of states to undermine any kind of common EU policy comes in fact from more humble concerns, such as those over illegal immigration, homegrown terrorism, environmental risks, human trafficking, and policing policy. These seem likely to be the areas that ultimately encourage greater communality in security policy than traditional diplomacy and statecraft. The EU, in fact, may ultimately pioneer in foreign policy from below, so to speak, though these areas are as yet also still fraught with tensions over national sovereignty in relation to traditions of criminal justice and the practicalities of how to manage immigration. The problem in Europe of undocumented or illegal immigrants is in fact a particularly urgent one. So to conclude, Europe cannot be reduced to the EU in the way that part of North America can be to the United States. A fundamental element in the official rhetoric of the EU is to make the confusion between them, as if the organizational and the geographical Europe map neatly onto each other. The issue is not the question of whether membership must cover all European states, but more profoundly, which ideas of Europe underpin the attempt to unify it. Is it geographical, cultural, or what? This is important geopolitically because confusing Europe with the EU presents a more homogeneous subject for discussion about the prospects for the global presence of the EU than the truly variegated and contested European Union ever could. Yet this geographical inheritance is more contestable than self-evident. While many of the largest states, particularly Britain and France, continue to harbor delusions of grandeur as independent operators, the EU is only likely to develop an effective common security framework by building from such relatively humble security policy arenas as terrorism, immigration, and environmental risk. Overall, however, in terms of securing a common European space, a separate political Europe is still more incipient than accomplished. Even if it does develop its collaborative and coordinating roles, it's not clear that a scaled-up state will ever replace the existing ones, as many scenarios about Europe as a future superpower seem to contend. A crucial issue in developing the basis for a collaborative security policy is the degree to which this Europe will remain entangled with an American foreign policy and a security apparatus, that of NATO, which seems increasingly at odds in method and geographical scope with the original Atlantic Compact. Strangely, at the moment when it seems least adapted to European goals, it has undergone a revival. This paradox may not last long if NATO's intervention in Afghanistan goes badly. A change in US administration could bring greater parallelism between US and European security goals. Of course, that change would also depend on how much the division between many European Union states and the US government over the Middle East in general and Iraq in particular can be transcended, and the extent to which the American war on terror is exacerbated by new events. But the profligacy of the US administration in spending its vast resources of political capital around the world after 9/11 will also not readily be undone. Even as the US then faces serious problems, Europe is neither ready, because Europe and the EU are not the same thing, nor capable in current world conditions of globalization and economic interdependence of, as we might put it in American baseball, of stepping up to the plate. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, John. We have because we record these sessions, we ask the people who have questions for you, speaking to the microphone. You can take your own questions, and I'll try to make sure people get the mic before they start speaking. So, who would like to begin?
Christopher Lane wrote that the United States has a long-standing policy of maintaining hegemony in Europe. And one could argue that the United States managed and prolonged the war in Bosnia in order to prove to Europeans, one, that they need NATO, two, that they need the United States in order to maintain this American hegemony in Europe. I'm wondering if you had a position on that as your third point.
Yeah, I think in some respects the continuation of NATO is sort of partly inertial. I think I was sort of very much sort of suggesting that that was the case, that there was a kind of comfort level between the various countries that are parts of that, at least up to a certain point. And particularly given the time that it took for the EU at the time of the events in Bosnia in 1992 through 1994 to organize any kind of intervention, it was ultimately under American pressure from the Clinton administration through NATO that actually there was any kind of intervention at all. So in a sense that becomes, you know, an important sort of example then. And the lesson, I think, from that is drawn in Europe. I think in some ways the revival of NATO in the years since then, since 94 onwards, does owe something to the fact that NATO at least sort of got around to intervening in that particular case, which was the most popular view amongst public opinion in many European countries. So in that sense, that kind of burnished NATO's image in a sense, and I think gave it a kind of popular mandate, if that's the right word, that in many ways has kind of given it this helped to give it this new lease on life. So I think you're absolutely right. The problem now is that the U.S. policy is more to turn NATO into a global alliance rather than just into a North Atlantic one. So Europe's position in it then becomes unclear, except insofar as a source of manpower or a kind of a source of support for what are essentially American policies. And I think this is where it then begins to sort of show signs of foundering.
If I may, I'd like to ask almost two questions in one that are very closely related. I've read some theorists who, I can't remember by name, who speak of above and beyond the special relationship between the U.S. and Britain, they speak of an Anglosphere, countries who are united by the English language and a strong civil society. Do you think that there could be such an affinity between these nations that could surpass something like maybe the EU? And also, do you think that the special relationship between Britain and the U.S. is likely to continue as it is, grow stronger, or maybe grow weaker?
Yeah, as to your first question, of course, this is not a new idea. It was an old one. I mean, it was very popular, particularly with people like Winston Churchill. You know, the idea of a kind of an English-speaking union of countries. And in fact, his original vision of the Atlantic Compact was very much that between Britain and the U.S. and Canada as an alternative to any kind of although he later came around to support some kind of European process of integration, I think this kind of idea does kind of recycle periodically. And a lot of it does have to do with the fact that a lot of public support for the EU in Britain is extremely weak or lukewarm, particularly for any kind of strengthening of the central institutions. So although the referendum on the new EU constitution lost in France and the Netherlands, it would have lost much more heavily in Britain than in either of those cases. I think that's the conventional wisdom. And there is a sense of affinity. You know, I wrote in a paper I wrote once that from a British point of view, you know, the Atlantic Ocean is narrower than the English Channel. And I think in some respects that's true, and that remains the case. And a lot of it has to do with ease of communication, cultural assumptions. The English like to think they've had a lot of influence, you know, on this side. That's probably, you know, not been true for a very long time, but nevertheless it's sort of a persisting illusion. So I think there are a lot of these things that do provide that kind of framework. And in terms of political economy, you can argue that for a long time, particularly since the 1980s, I wouldn't want to go back much before that, except back maybe to the 19th century, there has been a kind of an affiliation with liberal political economy in a way in both Britain and the United States that has set them apart from the more state-regulated, state-organized capitalism that you find in the rest of Europe. And at least you can make that kind of argument. But whether that's a realistic possibility, I think, these days is another thing. And I think it's not likely to really replace what has been in many ways more a security relationship and has been particularly strong since Suez, since 1956, when Britain sort of finally gave up, really, in many ways, being the kind of global policeman or whatever the metaphor was at the time, and in a sense allied itself so closely with the U.S. So I think that there's still a comfort level with having an alliance with the U.S., and that would probably continue even if NATO disintegrated, that Britain and the U.S. would have a fairly close relationship, I think. So that was what was it? I've now forgotten your second question. Just quickly.
One, if the Anglosphere would ever materialize, and two, if the special relationship between Britain and the U.S. would still continue on. But you can answer that.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
If NATO does not go well in Afghanistan and does tend to disintegrate, and if the European Union is not strong as a national security force, do you believe that Europe would more strongly rely on the United Nations or go more towards their states in external intervention?
Yeah, I think there's a at least at a kind of rhetorical level, I'm not sure one would want to push it further than that. There is a greater sort of sense of affiliation with the UN. For example, one of the main arguments about the war in Iraq wasn't so much over, for example, was getting rid of Saddam Hussein a good or a bad idea. It was more, could we get the Security Council of the United Nations to endorse that idea? And certainly that was very much the French position at the time, if you recall in 2003, that was, and partly you could say that's just cover, kind of provides a legitimacy or whatever. But I think in some quarters it does illustrate a greater commitment maybe to the idea of collective security, and that NATO in a way is a kind of out-of-date collective security organization, that it was designed really for the Cold War. And one way of doing this would be to say, hey, it really worked, great, congratulations, now let's do something different. And the idea of having a global NATO, there have been a whole load of articles in Foreign Affairs magazine, if anyone wants to read up on this, over the last year, trying to turn NATO into something, much more worldwide, strikes me as being very problematic. That isn't likely to work. So in that case, what kind of collective security organization might we have if we're looking for more multilateral types of entity? Then perhaps a revived, much revived United Nations, particularly Security Council, probably changed in how it works. I think the present UN system is just so slow and bureaucratized. But certainly in relation to these so-called humanitarian interventions, I think it would be much better to have it under the cloak, at least, of the UN than using these other old alliances.
My question is, as Russia now begins to re-centralize its power, and with the expansion of NATO, geopolitically, what kind of conflicts, if any, do you see between some of these Eastern European countries and Russia?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think the expansion of NATO has really been partly a strategy to, as I said, a kind of halfway house towards joining the EU. And so often the security type arguments have not been very well articulated. I don't think they were, for example, in extending the membership to the Baltic states or more recently to Romania and Bulgaria. And this is seen partly in Russia as a kind of sort of intimidation. I mean, the sense of being surrounded by NATO. For example, the current president of Georgia in the Caucasus has made it quite clear that one of his primary goals is to join NATO. But I think, then you read the next sentence and it's because he wants to join the EU. But the Russians don't get to that second sentence. They get to the first one, partly for self-serving reasons, not just because they're not interested in the other one, but because they want to have a sense of still having their own kind of sphere of influence in areas that they traditionally dominated. The Ukraine has been the most obvious of these cases in recent past, but there the whole issue of joining NATO seems recently to have been put on the back burner, partly because you have this peculiar coalition government now between two people who were sworn mortal enemies, last year. One of whom was very much in favor of joining NATO. The other, of course, was very much opposed to it and wanted to see the Ukraine allied with Russia. But Russia has really got more leverage, I think, because of its relative centralization, particularly of resource industries. And something like a quarter of the natural gas that's consumed in Western Europe now comes from Russia. And somewhere close to a half, actually, comes from Russia or goes through Russia. People forget about that part, that it's coming from Kazakhstan or whatever through some kind of pipeline that runs across Russian territory. So that gives the Russians a lot of leverage. Now, if that was controlled by, a myriad of small businesses or whatever, none of whom owed any kind of allegiance to the Kremlin, it wouldn't be much of a problem. But in fact, Gazprom, you know, the main natural gas company, has got bigger and bigger and bigger, and by and large, the state is becoming more and more the major player in the oil and natural gas sectors in Russia, and that gives them a kind of control over these resources that I think does scare some people in Western Europe. There are a variety of ways out of this. One would be to try and diversify sources towards, say, North Africa, for example, with natural gas. But there are real limits to which you can pursue that policy. So eventually, I think the EU and Russia are going to have to come to some kind of agreement over these things. But this is likely to give the Russians a lot more political leverage, particularly over the small states in the Caucasus and the Ukraine and so on, than I think many people in Europe would like to see.
You're familiar with Ms. Reed's book on the United States of Europe, where he makes a strong case for the unification of Europe. Beginning of your lecture, you seem to downplay that unification.
Yeah, there have been a number of books that have. I have a longer paper here where I actually talk about some of these books that have appeared in recent years on European integration, but also that suggests that the U.S. is going to that the EU is going to become some kind of superpower or something equivalent to the U.S. or perhaps even the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I must say, just and perhaps it's because I'm English. I mean, maybe that's the part of the problem here. Many of the people who write these books are Americans, interestingly, rather than Europeans. And I think many of them are attracted to the idea of a more multipolar world. I think they would like to see, and for historic reasons. It's a more kind of stable world if you have many centers. If you have China over here, you have a unified Europe over here. You have the United States over here. It's like a blowing up to a world scale of the kind of Congress of Vienna type of Europe. So the idea is you have this kind of balance of power system, if you like. But I think that in a sense, their thesis then is running way ahead of the evidence for the emergence of the EU as any kind of well-coordinated enterprise. And it's based on the idea that the EU will become some kind of super state, exactly a United States of Europe. And certainly at the moment and for the foreseeable future, I just don't see that happening. And I try to suggest in here some of the reasons why not. I'm just looking here for some of the titles of some of these books that have appeared in recent years. T.R. Reed's book, The United States of Europe, The New Superpower and the End of American Supremacy. That would be one example of this literature. There's a British version of this, Mark Leonard's book, who's a Blairite, someone close to Tony Blair, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. I mean, there are lots of books with these kinds of titles. I suppose what I was trying to lay out here today were all of the things that lay in between now and then, the barriers to the achievement of that, the difficulties of disentangling the EU from the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy, at least in the security area, the difficulties now given the reassertion of states within Europe, France and Britain I was pointing to in particular, who are not likely to subsume their particular views, I think, into some kind of compound European position. And then finally, the difficulties of defining exactly what Europe itself is. And all of these books confuse the Europe with the EU, which is precisely the point that I was trying to make at the beginning, that they're not the same thing. And that this confusion in official EU discourse between the two is disingenuous, and that makes it appear that there's something here much more homogeneous, much more coherent than actually is the case.
As far hello, okay. As far as relationships between the United States and Europe, and the outlook on security, how big of a role does it play that the United States kind of sees themselves as the #1 target for terrorists, and therefore they're turning to Europe to get as many friends around them as they can for security purposes, and European countries feeling that if they just stay out of the fight, then it won't become their problem?
Yeah, I don't, just to answer your last part first, I don't think that's really the perception. I think there is a view, certainly in large parts of Europe, that this isn't an American problem, that it is a global problem, and that they're as involved in it as the U.S. is. In fact, there was a lot of resentment in some European countries, particularly in Britain after September the 11th, when Americans interpreted the attacks of September the 11th as solely an attack on the United States. Partly, I mean, the Pentagon attack, yeah, you could perhaps interpret that way. But the attack on the World Trade Center was much more an attack on the world economy and an attack on all those people who were working in that building. You may recall that, in fact, many of the people who died on September the 11th were not citizens of the United States. In fact, there were a large number of people who were citizens of other countries, including many European countries. And so the interpretation, anyway, in many European countries initially, right after the attacks, was that this was an attack on the world, or an attack on the way the world had developed over the past, several hundred years. And so that the people who were engaged in these kinds of acts then were a common foe. And when the response was seen as being kind of narrowly nationalist in the United States, that it was about sacrificing for the United States, that people felt very sorry for the firemen and firefighters, and so of course, but the point was that in fact that the target could have been in London, it could have been in Amsterdam, it could have been in Madrid, and of course since that time we've seen attacks in all of those cities. So I don't think that that's really what's driving this. I think it's that the rhetoric of the war on terror, it doesn't really identify who the target is. I mean, you can't really have an attack on a kind of a method of conducting warfare. You can have an attack on people who are conducting a method of warfare. But that's been reduced to a very much a kind of defense of the United States. Even the language of things like homeland security in the U.S. Actually upsets some Europeans because it suggests that, oh, well, we can, those guys can be sort of hung out to dry, so to speak. So I think that it could have been dealt with in a more kind of inclusionary sort of way, I think. But I think that has created a lot of ill feeling. I think that's true. And not just in countries where anti-Americanism has often been quite strong, like France, but even in countries like Britain, which have no history of that whatsoever. And so I think that's definitely something that the U.S. government should try and address, I think, if it wants to win more friends and influence more people.
Well, speaking of failure to be inclusionary, we have several other people who've indicated they'd like to ask a question, but it's our custom to try to end right on time because people have other classes to get to as well. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Agnew for this terrific tour of the horizon.